there's also a study in Europe of getting people who don't know how to flirt properly, how to chat people up,
Yeah.
giving them practice by interacting with AI agents to like perfect their like chat, their their ability to flirt. And they found that actually that interacting with these flirtatious AI agents did improve the ability of the human beings to flirt. But the problem was that when these people were then set loose into the wild to go flirt with real other humans, they wound up preferring flirting with a machine because, of course, when you flirt with a real person, you risk rejection and awkwardness. So the AI agent was able to improve your flirting ability, but wrongly, then you became more attached to this machine than to a real person.
Nicholas Christakis is the Sterling Professor of Social and Natural Science at Yale University, where he also directs the Human Nature Lab. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, and he's also the author of Blueprint, the Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. So, Nicholas Christakis, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip.
Can you tell us about the Human Nature Lab and just tell us, well, what does it do and what's its objectives?
First of all, I find human nature to be a deeply interesting feature of the natural world, right? These qualities that we have, that we manifest as a species, that have been shaped by natural selection for eons, are complicated. They are a feature of the natural world, and they're deeply important to our own experience of the world. So I find human nature just a really interesting topic. But the part of human nature that we focus on in my group is that part which we manifest between each other. So I'm not so interested, for example, in our innate capacity for visual perception or emotional experience within ourselves or risk aversion. How do we judge risk, for example? These are or anger or bravery or cognition. These are all things that we manifest, are part of human nature. We manifest in ourselves. I'm interested in those parts that we express interindividually. So our capacity for love and friendship and cooperation and social learning. So all of these interpersonal features of human nature are the focus of my laboratory. My
Okay.
group my group has 5 divisions. The first division is concerned with the biology of human social interaction. So the genetics, like for example, why do we even have friends at all? So, like other animals that reproduce sexually, we mate with each other, but we do something that's very weird in the animal kingdom, which is that we form long-term, non-reproductive, volitional unions with unrelated conspecifics. Namely, we have friends. And this is really rare. We do it, certain other primates do it, elephants do it, and certain cetacean species do it. So this thing we take for granted, which is that we have friendships, has been shaped by natural selection. It affects every aspect of our lives, our ability to find work when we lose a job, whether we are happy or sad, whether we're exposed to COVID. Your risk of infection depends on your connection to other people and the mathematics of the networks around you. So we study the evolutionary origin, the genetics, and the physiology of friendship. For example, why do you feel good in the company of your friends? Your body evolved so that you have this sort of pleasant feeling. Your heart rate goes down, your fibrinogen level, other biomarkers change when you're in the company of your friends. Or in our most recent paper, we just had a paper in Nature 6 months ago or a year ago on the microbiome. These bacteria that are inside or in and on our bodies, they treat our social networks as the extended environment in which they live. So just like in a patch of dirt, every little square foot will have different microbes depending on the features of that dirt. How watery is it, how much sunlight, how much leaf debris. Our social networks, I have friends and those friends have friends. We have these elaborate mathematical structures that we make, these complex hyperdimensional surfaces. The microbes occupy particular niches within our networks. So we make these networks, and then these microbes move through these little networks in ways that, advantage them. So, and finally, we have a new initiative on human social chemosignaling. So how we use olfaction, like why when you might smell someone and instantly trust them, for example, or like them. So that's all the first part of the lab, the biology of social interaction.
Human interactions have become less and less face-to-face interactions, and they become much more online
Yes.
interactions. And there's less and less opportunity for face-to-face interactions, and less opportunity for the exchange of microbes or anything else on that personal kind of
Yes.
level. So how is that affecting our human environment?
So that's a big question. Let me start with one aspect of it, which is this is very speculative, but I think part of the reason that we're having a lot of toxic interactions online, and I also think part of the reason that people are finding online relationships less fulfilling and or that we have a mental health crisis amongst young people, of course, just as you suggested, has to do with the decline in face-to-face interactions. But a small part, but part of that, I think, does, believe it or not, relate to this issue of olfaction. Because of course, when we pick who we interact with, we are guided by cultural constraints and cues. Your friends tend to be those people at your school, and which school you go to has to do with the politics and your parents of your community and your parents' decisions and all kinds of things outside you. But nevertheless, you get to this school, and then among the candidates who you might befriend, you use auditory and visual cues. You judge that person's personality, you judge their suitability, but you also use olfactory cues, like many other social animals. And these don't exist. The visual and the auditory ones, of course, can exist online, but the olfactory ones do not exist. So I think that is very speculative, but I do think that some small part of the awkwardness of online interactions relates to the fact that we do not have the capacity for olfaction in online interactions. However, having said that, there's a body of work that we've done that's looked at whether the mathematical structure of human social networks online is materially different and in what ways it's different than the kind of networks that we have made for thousands of years. So, for example, my laboratory has mapped social networks amongst the Hadza hunter-gatherers in Tanzania, a group of people that lived like all humans did, through the Pleistocene. So
Mm.
until 10,000 years ago, we've mapped the networks of the Nyangatom population in Sudan. We've mapped networks in India and Honduras, in the United States, all over the world. And everywhere we go, we find that the structure of human face-to-face networks is very similar, mathematically speaking, the topology, the architecture of the ties. Um, and that's precisely because natural selection shaped us to have these kinds of friendships. So let me give you a specific example.
Mm.
And that in all of modern technology, telephony and the internet are grafted onto this ancient predicate. So we use the phone and we use the internet to serve ancient predilections that we have. So a very crystallizing example is the following. If you could speak to my Greek grandmother who lived in a little village in southern Greece, in the south of Greece, 100 years ago, and you could ask her when she was 10 or 11, how many friends do you have? She would have said to you, I have one or two best friends, and there are four or five of us girls, we hang out together. And if you had asked my daughter Eleni, who's now 29, the same question when she was 11 and she had a iPhone in her pocket 100 years later, she would give you the same answer. In other words, despite the existence of this telephone, this in our pockets, despite the existence of social media, despite the invention of all of these things, which you rightly are highlighting as features of modernity that may adversely affect our social interactions, there are other fundamental aspects of our social interactions which don't change, like we have one or two best friends. The invention of the internet did not give us the capacity to have 20 best friends. We don't do that any more than the invention of the telephone made us polygynous. We are fundamentally a monogamous species. And the all of this ability to contact lots of potential partners doesn't really change that fundamental reality. So, so my answer to your question is that you are right that there are many aspects of social interaction that are changed by online media, but there are also fundamental things that are not changed. Both are true.
But this leads to an interesting problem then, doesn't it? Because if we are hardwired for particular kinds of interactions and particular kinds of environment, physical environments, what happens when our environment changes so that we now find ourselves living in a different kind of environment? I'm talking about, say, an online environment or some other environment
Yes.
which we were not evolutionarily suited for. Does that create some kind of mismatch?
Yeah, and I think a very good analogy for that is that, our bodies were shaped during an evolutionary past in which we lacked access to fat and, easy calories and certain nutrients like salt was, we find salt very appealing because when we encountered salt, tens of thousands of years ago, we needed to eat it. Uh, and of course, now in a environment with when food is abundant, I mean, I don't, these numbers are not exactly right, and they're actually in my book Blueprint, but I think that the average American a century ago spent like 40% or 50% of their income on food. And now I think the average American spends like 10% or 5 to 10% of their income on food. Because of course, the success of modern society has brought down the real price of food.
Of
Uh,
course, even before that, we would spend 90% of our time searching for food in those
yeah,
primitive societies.
I don't know if it was quite 90%, but you're right.
Right.
A large amount of our time. We were also moving and we were also building dwellings and searching for mates and doing lots of things. But you're absolutely right. Used as a fraction of time. So the average person nowadays only works, I don't know, an hour a day to meet their food needs in modern societies. So 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 that's another indicator of the plentiful availability of calories and other desirable foods. And of course, this has resulted in the obesity epidemic. But it hasn't changed the physiology of our pancreas. Our pancreas and our stomachs are still the same pancreases and stomachs we had, 3,000 and 10,000 years ago. So you're right to ask the question, in what ways does the availability of modern social media technology reshape social interactions? And there are some ways, more than a few. For example, anonymity. we're not we didn't evolve for anonymous social interactions. We maybe the person was a stranger to us, but we could see their faces. And if we ever saw them again and they were mean to us, if they assaulted us, we would know who they are. We would remember them. And now, anonymity is not very conducive to civilized interactions or face-to-face interactions. People become very abusive and very antisocial when they are anonymous. And of course, these online tools allow anonymity. Another thing that's different is, of course, the scale. Um, so, for example, on a positive side, we evolved to be a cooperative species. We tend to work together. We do that naturally, but the internet has turbocharged that cooperation. So, for example, we can all work together to make Wikipedia, which is
Yeah.
miraculous, right? So, to have a crowdsourced uh, encyclopedia is a manifestation of human cooperation that has been facilitated on a large scale that would not have been easily possible prior to the internet. So those are two examples, negative and positive, of the way internet technology exploits inborn features of our nature for ill or for good. So yes, there are things that are different.
What effect is anonymity and the use of avatars where you don't actually see the person anymore? What effect is that having on our social interactions? Is that a positive or is that a negative?
Well, I think they're both positives and negatives. First of all, previously anonymity was difficult to achieve, but people tried. For example, they were masked balls. If you think of the kind of sexually licentious sort of balls that were had in Europe, over the last 300 or 400 years, people would come with masks precisely because hiding yourself sort of loosened you up and made it possible for you to do good and bad things that you wouldn't otherwise do, let's say. or body paint or adornment or changing. People attempted to like pass for someone else or hide their identity. But as you said, it was difficult to do. The people who defend anonymity online rightly point to the fact that it empowers otherwise disadvantaged groups to express themselves. So, if you have an unpopular view and will be crushed in a domineering society, then having anonymity can be very, very helpful. Let's say in a very conformist society, anonymity, would be a benefit. On the
But
other
there's another side to that coin, isn't there? Because you have the ability to troll other people.
yes, that's exactly what I was about to say. So, but the
Right.
negative of that is that now disinhibited from these things, people become quite atrocious in their behavior online. And I used to get, there was a period in my life when a couple of periods in my life I've had when I would get, uh, threats, online threats from anonymous people. And I had read somewhere 20 years ago or more about how to cope with such threats. And one of the pieces of advice was, well, one piece of advice was just ignore them, which I can see the wisdom of that. Another piece of advice was, well, go around with them, try to engage with them. So I had this kind of way I would respond to people who would say stupid or vile things to me anonymously. I'd or who would sound off. Let's say they saw a clip of something I said and didn't really understand who I was, or the clip was removed from the larger context, so they didn't really
Yeah.
understand what's going on. They were just like, so I would write back to them, and then they would respond to me. They would say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, that you were a real human being." They thought they were just sending this hatred into the void. They were just sounding off and not realizing that. And experiments have been done looking at this. There was a experiment that was done where people online would like express racist invective against others. And the intervention was that a third party would speak to the first person who was sending the racist invective against the second person. A third party would write to the first person and say, "I'm sorry, this other person's a human being." And just a very light sort of, reminder of our common humanity was very effective at reducing this person's bad behavior for months afterwards.
Of course, you've always had that kind of bad behavior even before the internet. And the thing which comes to my mind is when people are driving motor cars,
Yes,
they're often very vocal, very aggressive, very saying things which they wouldn't say to you face to face because they probably feel protected
yes, and
within the motor
anonymous.
car environment.
Yes, I think road rage is an excellent example. Uh, um, and we evolved. I was having a conversation with my wife about this actually earlier today, but we evolved also to feel like a lot of male violence in the world relates to feelings of humiliation and shame. So a lot of these people that go out on young men, they're almost always men who go on these mass killings. It's because they're either been unloved or because they've been made to feel humiliated or ashamed of themselves. So shame and humiliation are very powerful emotions.
Is
And
that the incel community we're talking about here?
not only, but for example, that would be an example, so-called. But no, I think that there are many, many situations in which people respond to feelings of humiliation and shame by resorting to violence. And this resulted in all these kinds of codes of conduct and nicety, chivalrous codes and so on to try to prevent or restrain this kind of violence. I would love an opportunity to put a few other branches of my lab on the table, but we could spend all of our time talking about what we're talking about. It's not that it's terrific, but there are other things that we do in the human nature lab beyond study our innate sociality.
Tell me some of the other bits.
So, for example, another branch of our lab, we've written some software that allows us to create temporary artificial societies of real people online. And tens of thousands of research subjects have come to our online laboratory. And we, in a kind of godlike way, can engineer the social interactions. So we can drop 1,000 people into a social network with one structure, a set of social networks with one structure, and another 1,000 people into a set of social networks with a different structure. like two different patterns of social interaction, which we engineer. And then we can say, okay, which group is more cooperative? Like, can we modify the social interactions between people? And the metaphor I give for this is the allotropes of carbon. And as we all learned in high school chemistry, if you take carbon atoms and assemble them one way, in hexagonal sheets, you get graphite, which is soft and dark, or you take carbon atoms and assemble them another way in tetrahedrons, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And
What kind of different social interactions are you controlling here? I mean, you be more specific about how the networks are
yeah,
put together.
Yeah, so those two, you can think of those two structures of carbon that I just mentioned as two different topologies, two different ways of arranging the atoms.
Yeah.
But the key intellectual idea has to do with this very old idea in science known, I'm sure you're familiar with, known as emergence. So
Yeah.
the thing to understand here is that the properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness of the carbon allotropes are not properties of the carbon atoms, they are properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get one set of properties. Take the same carbon atoms and connect them another way, you get a different set of properties. And in my laboratory, we've shown that you can take people and connect them one way, and they are happy and healthy and wealthy and innovative. Or you take the same people and connect them a different way, and they are unhappy and unhealthy and poor and uninnovative.
How
So
can that be? I mean, what kind of connections can cause that kind of change?
So imagine you take 100 buttons and you drop the buttons on the floor, and there's sort of a random pattern. And now you have, 500 threads, and you pick two buttons at random and you connect them with a thread. And you
Hmm.
keep doing this iteratively until you've used up all 500 threads. And so now
Yeah.
you look at the buttons and they're 100 buttons and they're 500 threads connecting random pairs of buttons together. So the first question I would invite listeners to imagine is the following idea. You let's say you take a picture of that mess on the floor, and now you lean over and you pick up one button and you lift it up into the air. And you should have the intuition that all the other buttons would follow it, and there'd be a layer of buttons like one thread away from this button and another layer of buttons two threads away, and so on. And then you rotate to another part of the floor and you drop the buttons. And now you take a picture again. In two-dimensional space, you should have the intuition that the pictures of this mess of buttons will be completely different. But there's something fundamental that hasn't changed.
Hmm.
And that's the topological
Topology. Yeah.
architecture. That's
Yeah.
the pattern of connection is the same in both of these situations. First point. Second point, you should have the intuition that when you pick up these buttons, there might be some buttons that were never selected at random. So there'll be some buttons left behind. They had no connections. These are the hermits. So something that's spreading across the ties in this mess of buttons, some of which were never selected and therefore are not connected to what's called the giant component of the network. Uh, if a pathogen is spreading, they would never infect that person. So this metaphor offers a number of observations. First of all, your risk of getting an infection depends on whether you are or not connected to the giant component. Second, even within the giant component, whether you get an infection depends on how in the thick of it, how in the middle of this gamish of buttons you are. And third, that there's something deep and fundamental about this structure, this topology. And now you can imagine that there are many different ways of arranging the buttons. Maybe like you can arrange them in a big ring, like maybe instead of randomly picking the threads, you systematically knit them together and you get a big ring shape of 100 buttons and 500 threads. And that big ring shape will be different than this random network we discussed a moment ago. So that's the point. We humans do the same thing. We arrange ourselves into structures naturally, which affect our ability, the ability of groups to achieve certain objectives. And my laboratory in this other branch of the lab does experiments with this and tests um, how do different social arrangements, how do different topological architectures of human beings affect these emergent properties, these collective properties of groups. And
Right.
it's
And so
very
this is
important because a firm might have, and we've done studies of this. You could have 1,000 engineers working for you with certain qualifications and certain education and certain human capital. And in your firm, those 1,000 engineers are arranged in a way where they're making important discoveries and they're being highly innovative. But in a different firm with the same human capital, the same engineers, they are not producing innovations. They're not producing patentable ideas. because of how they're interconnected, so
Yeah.
how the desks are arranged on the shop floor. Change.
This has huge impact for lots of things, but let's take initially the ordinary human relationships. Now, you said that your mother and your daughter, they would have two or three close friends and maybe some other acquaintances. So when you make your connections in your lab, do you find that there's an optimal set of connections for a happy person, which maybe has just two close friends and three or four,
Oh, I think.
or is it completely different from that? Does it mirror
Well,
real life or does it not mirror real life?
well,
What
I
makes
don't. I don't engineer my lab to. I mean, I certainly broker introductions that I think would be scientifically or personally useful. By the way, that's another natural tendency that we introduce our friends to each other, which we
yeah.
take for granted, but we do it in a thoughtful way, very naturally. But uh, but yes, people have studied. I've done a little work in this area, how the performance of groups, for example, scientific groups, depends on the network structure. Let me give you an example. This is not my work. This is work done by Brian Utsey at Northwestern University. So Brian, many years ago, became unaccountably interested in the success or failure of Broadway musicals. So Broadway musicals are a huge business. They cost, hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, and either they're a total flop and you lose all of your money, or they are a huge success and you make billions. And so they're very important, very risky business. And what Brian did is he took 326 Broadway musical production companies, the director, the producer, the actors, the musicians, the libretticists, all the people that put on a show, the costume designer. And he mapped the networks of these 326 Broadway musical production uh, companies. And he quantified something about these groups of people, these 320 groups of people, known as the density. And that's the fraction of all possible ties that is present. So, for example, if you have one person with 5 connections, among those 5 people, there are 5 times 4 divided by 2, 10 possible connections. So, if one central person, 5 people around them, there are 10 possible connections among those people. And you can now imagine a set of alternatives. All 10 of those ties might be present. 4 of those connections might be present, or none of them might be present. And that's mathematically quantifiable. So he quantified that for all of these 326 Broadway musical production companies, and he put that on the x-axis of a graph. And on the y-axis, he put whether the show that they developed was a success or a failure. And he quantified success or failure based on the fraction of positive reviews and the amount of money that the show made.
Yeah.
And he found a parabolic shape. So if nobody knew each other from before, so density was low, none of those connections were present, the show was a flop. And if everybody knew each other from before, all 10 of the connections were present, the show was a flop. Optimal performance was in the intermediate regime of density.
Is that
So
to do with creativity?
yes, the ability of the group to be creative depends not just on who the individuals are, but on the structure of their interactions within the
Yeah.
network. And
Mm.
so this is a specific example, for instance, of how different. And then he repeated this work, Brian repeated this work, looking at millions of scientific publications, looking at the groups of scientists that work together on a project. And he used as a proxy for quality the citation count of the papers. So on the x-axis, he computed something similar to this density measure that we just described. It's not exactly the same, but similar. And on the y-axis now, for millions of scientific groups, he computed the number of citations, and he gets the same parabolic shape. So basically, a group of scientists that keeps doing the same thing again and again and again, working together, is not very innovative. And a group of scientists who are thrown together who've never worked together before, they don't really come up with anything either. You need something in the middle. And so that's an example of how real life examples of how network structure can affect the performance of groups.
Okay, let me throw a new idea into this
All right,
whole
but just again,
discussion.
that's the second part of my lab. 3 more to
Well,
go.
this might move on to another part. It might be
All right.
one of your other things. But if I throw AI,
But as you can see, Philip, I'm obsessed with this topic. I'm
no,
obsessed.
it's a good topic. I'm getting infectiously connected to it as well. But If we put AI into this mix,
Yes. So that's the third division of my lab.
good.
We study hybrid systems of humans and machines. Now, what my laboratory is interested in is not so much the human-machine interaction, but the human-human interaction in the presence of the machine. So let me give you a metaphor, a toy example to fix ideas. So imagine a digital assistant like an Alexa. Uh, the manufacturer of an Alexa is very concerned about optimizing it for the performance with the owner, with the human user. So you would never buy an Alexa if every time you wanted to use it, you had to say something like, "Excuse me, Alexa, I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but if you don't mind, would you please tell me the weather tomorrow?" This would be an absurd level of politeness, maybe not for a Brit, but an absurd level of politeness with a machine. You expect to be able to say, "Alexa, weather," and the machine responds. And that's fine until you bring that machine into your house and your children, in talking to that machine, learn to be rude. And then your children go to the playground and they are rude to other children.
Yeah.
So the introduction of this machine into our social fabric is changing how we treat each other. And this is what my laboratory has been studying for 10 years in another division of the lab that studies hybrid systems of humans and machines. And our first paper was published almost 10 years ago now, this paper I mentioned in Nature. And what we showed was that we gave human beings a classic problem borrowed from computer science called the graph coloring problem. Maybe you know that, or others have heard of
Yeah.
it.
Four colors.
Yeah, well, that's the map coloring. So we the graph coloring problem. That's right. The map coloring is a special case of the graph coloring problem. The graph coloring problem is you have a group of people, in my case, in a network, and you give them a set of colors, and they each have to pick a color dissimilar from their neighbors.
Yeah.
And every graph has something called the chromatic number, which is the minimum number of colors that are required to color the graph. And so listeners should have the intuition that if you had a group of 100 people, each of whom had some friends in some kind of network, if you gave the human beings 1,000,000 colors to pick from, it'd be very easy for each of them to pick a random color and they would not be in conflict with their neighbors. They would have a color similar than their neighbors. But the minimum number is the number, like if, on the other hand, if you gave them one color or two colors to pick from, there's no solution to the problem. Like there's no way everyone can pick a color dissimilar. So there's some number known as the chromatic number, which is the minimum number required to color the graph. So we dropped 4,000 people into 230 groups in this experiment. And we created our arbitrary connections in these networks, and we told the human beings, pick a color dissimilar from your neighbors. And the people, were able to, there was a countdown clock, and we said, if and only if all of you work together to color the graph, you get paid. You have to coordinate, you have to work together to solve the problem. Otherwise, you get nothing. If at the end of the 5 minutes, there's still some people in color conflict, you get nothing. So everyone looks around at their neighbors. They say, oh, I'm green, and I have 2 greens and 1 orange and no purple friends. I'm going to switch my color to purple, so I won't be in conflict with either my green or my orange neighbors. So everyone is doing that, switching, and they're using rational heuristics for this. They typically pick the color that minimizes the conflict with their neighbors. And then at some point, everyone has done the best that they can do, but the problem isn't solved. There's some people that have a conflicts with each other, and none of them can make a rational move and pick a color that reduces conflict. So the group is stuck in this suboptimal situation. And we showed that adding simple autonomous agents, AI, with simple behavior, we added, which was that they had a little noise. They made random moves occasionally, unlocked a solution. Now, there's actually a deep, the issue of noise in natural phenomena is itself very deep. It's similar to heat in chemistry or catalysis or mutation in biology or simulated annealing, or there's lots of ideas we can explore, but you don't necessarily want perfection when units are interacting. You want a little bit of randomness, which can help the group reach a stable equilibrium more readily.
So that's an unintuitive result, really, isn't it?
Yes, well, maybe that's why it was published where it was published. But the point is, we showed that you could add for simple forms of AI into social systems and facilitate the ability of these systems to perform better. In this case we've discussed so far, it's coordination, but we later on showed that this could be done with navigation, with cooperation, with all kinds of collective action problems, adding simple autonomous agents that act with decentralized knowledge. They do not need an omniscient view of the whole system. Just each of these agents sprinkled into the network, acting only with local knowledge, can help the group converge on a globally optimal solution. So yes, we're very interested in AI. And we're very interested, as I said, in the specific aspect of it, which goes back to our introduction about human nature, the parts of human nature that our group is interested in, which is what we express between ourselves. And so let me give you another example of this. This is other people's work, not my work. So listeners may be familiar with the landmark invention by DeepMind of AlphaGo a few years ago, which is a Go playing software. And in the process by which they invented this artificial intelligence agent that played Go was itself very interesting. It involved iterative exploration. They had to train the model. Eventually, the model challenges the reigning world champion, a man by the name of Lee Sedol in Korea. And Lee Sedol, by the way, is a hero in Korea in the way that we in our country might revere cricketers or soccer players. So like he's on ramen noodle bags and on cereal boxes, like he's like a Go playing champion. So the fateful day comes to play Go. Five matches, 3 out of 5 win. Either the machine or Lee will win. And I knew Lee was too cocky going in. And so Lee comes in and he loses the first match. And he's very surprised that he loses the match. I'm watching these matches. And then he loses the second match. And all the Korean and Japanese and Chinese commentators are marveling at AlphaGo. Like it's making these very weird moves. And later they studied and they found that some of these moves had been played in medieval times because we have thousands of years of records of Go games that were played in like the Japanese court or the Chinese court. We literally know the sequence of moves. So they go back and they find, my God, the Go masters from 1,000 years ago were playing these kinds of crazy moves. But not always. Sometimes the moves have never been seen in human history. Lee then loses the third match and he's very upset. And I'm upset. Like I'm really upset that this machine has bested us. But Lee comes back in the fourth game and he beats the damn machine. And I almost wept. I was so happy that this superhuman achievement by this human being, that he came back and he beat the damn machine, I was just so proud for our species in that situation. And then he lost the fifth game, but he won 1 out of 5. But here's the thing. Here's the reason I'm telling this story. Because Lee later on said that in playing with the machine, he was elevated. His Go playing changed after playing with the machine. And then another group of scientists that studied the innovativeness of Go moves in professional Go playing for the last century or the last 50 years. So they're plotting like the innovativeness of Go moves. On the x-axis is year, from 1950 to the present. On the y-axis is innovativeness of moves. All of a sudden, after AlphaGo is invented, there's a skyrocketing in human innovation. That it unlocked, these are human-human matches now, all right? So how the human Go players played with each other was changed by the introduction of this very high-quality AI into our system. So this is another whole topic that we're exploring, is how the introduction of AI is changing collective action.
There's also the impact of how AI is changing individual action too, because AI, and particularly through things like ChatGPT and DeepSeek, those kind of things, they have now easily passed the Turing test some time ago, which meant that they can't be easily distinguished between human beings and machines. And as a consequence of this, many people are, or I hear reports of people, setting up relationships with these AIs in the sense that they become substitute human companions. Have you got any thoughts on that side of the matter?
There's also a study in Europe of getting people who don't know how to flirt properly, how to chat people up,
Yeah.
giving them practice by interacting with AI agents to like perfect their like chat, their their ability to flirt. And they found that actually that interacting with these flirtatious AI agents did improve the ability of the human beings to flirt. But the problem was that when these people were then set loose into the wild to go flirt with real other humans, they wound up preferring flirting with a machine because, of course, when you flirt with a real person, you risk rejection and awkwardness. So the AI agent was able to improve your flirting ability, but wrongly, then you became more attached to this machine than to a real person. So so you're right to ask the question of how these to what extent these machines could replace human social interactions. But as we discussed at the beginning, I think there's something ineluctable, something very fundamental about human interactions that after the initial love affair with AI wears off. For example, even internet, like even all these dating apps, there's a right now, like young people are just we've gone through 10 or 20 years of dating apps being the way people find their partners. And I have many successful marriages among my students. I'm 63. I met my wife the old-fashioned way, face to face. We were set up by friends. But for the last 10 or 20 years, amongst my students, maybe 50% of the marriages have arisen from dating apps. There's nothing intrinsically wrong with dating apps, but people are finding them increasingly annoying and depressing and inhuman in some ways. So there's like a rediscovery of the idea of having a dinner party or having your friends say, it's amazing. I had my friends set me up and I found this great guy or I found this great girl. It's a shocking discovery that you can use, old technology to have successful unions. So I think we're going to see a kind of reaction against uh, the dating apps. We're beginning to see that. And I think eventually, after a love affair with AI that'll go on for 10 years, eventually we'll say, you know what? Actually, talking to a real person is better and it has some kind of qualities to it that the machine cannot capture.
But
And this goes back to the olfaction point we made at the beginning, by the way, too.
is there not a more serious danger for the individual who sets up a very complex relationship with an AI, basically falls in love with the AI, can't live without the AI, and yet that relationship can't ultimately be satisfied.
Yes, I think that's really,
And
I think inhuman. I mean, I don't think that's, and I think science fiction writers have been writing about this for a very long time. That's exactly right.
I mean, people may enter these kind of relationships because they're lonely. But is
Yes.
this the sort of thing which will solve loneliness, or will it make loneliness worse?
Well, I think it's a little bit like vaping for nicotine. Like if you ask me, is it better to vape than to smoke cigarettes? I would say yes. But if you ask me, is it better to vape than not smoke at all? I would say no. So if you ask me, is having an AI companion, if you're an 80-year-old isolated widower or widow, better than nothing? I would say probably yes. Is it better than having a real social relationship? No, it's not. So I think it's hard to make blanket statements because there are pros and cons to different aspects of this. Like would it, you know, would I have a more fulfilling experience if I partnered with a young scientist to work on a research project than if I partnered with a really good AI agent? Yes, I would rather partner with a real human being, another scientist with a creative and fertile mind. But is it better to have AI support for my scientific thinking than not to? Then probably no. By the way, I don't use AI, which many people have criticized me for. They're like, you're not using ChatGPT to do science, and my answer is no, I am not actually. But probably I'll have to yield eventually.
One of the few that's left, I would think.
Apparently.
Um, what about the way in which AI is shaping or society's relationships? Do you see a positive future for that, or a negative future in the sense of how is it affecting us as human beings, and how will it affect us over the next 2, 3, 5 years?
Well, I think I think in both good and bad ways. I mean, I think, I'm having a hard time forming a fixed opinion about the promise of AI and the dangers of AI for our society as a whole. And to the, there's most of your listeners or some of your listeners may know this or some may not, I don't know, but there's a movie called Fiddler on the Roof. And do you know this movie? And there's a scene in the movie where Reb Tevye is this humble milkman in a little village of Anatevka, a Jewish village that's subject to the anti-Semitic pogroms. And they're being driven out of Russia. It's 100 years ago. Many of them fled to the United States.
Yeah.
And anyway, he's a very lovable and deep thinking man, this milkman, Reb Tevye. And Reb Tevye one day is in the village square, and there's a big argument going on. And someone makes a point, and Reb Tevye says, "You're right." And then someone makes the opposite point, and Reb Tevye says, "You're right too." And then a third person says, "Reb Tevye, they can't both be right." And he goes, "You're also right." And 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 this is how I feel about AI right now. I listen to very smart computer scientists and very smart tech billionaires, and some of them say AI is safe and will lead to great abundance and is a miraculous innovation. And I think, yeah, that's believable. I believe them. And then other equally smart computer scientists and equally smart tech billionaires say, no, it's super dangerous. It's going to be really harmful for society. And I'm like, well, they're also right. And well, they can't both be right. Well, that's also correct. I mean, I don't, if you forced me, I would think that it's very dangerous to be a Luddite, and that ultimately the AI will be like the Industrial Revolution, except faster, and will lead to radical disruption and change in our society. And when we see the other side of it in 20 years, um, we'll look back and think it was a net benefit. So
That's if we
I think
survive.
in the short run, it's going to be, yeah, I think in the short run, it's going to be very disruptive and many harms,
Yeah.
in addition to benefits. But I think maybe in the long run, it'll be seen as a net benefit. But I also think it'll contribute to a kind of atavistic uh, discovery of ancient. I think we're going to find a world in which in 20 years, there'll be a huge premium on real people, like on interacting with real people. One way to think about this is like eventually, we may have humanoid robots that people can have sex with, for example. And maybe for a while, people will think this is terrific, but ultimately, people will say, no, actually, for millions of years, we were having sex with other members of our species, and that's really superior to, a sex with a machine. And I think with AI will be the kind of cognitive analog of that. Initially, it'll be very seductive to interact with these machines, but eventually we're going to return to, as a matter of
More,
equilibrium,
more
to our
primitive
innate
ways.
humanity and want,
Yeah.
yes, primitive and deep and moral and humane, fundamental face-to-face interactions.
We're running out of time, and I wanted to ask you one last question, which might help summarize things a little
There's
bit.
still two more divisions. There's still two more.
Well,
There's
I've
still
got
two
time
more
if you've
divisions.
got time, but I mean, you're the professor with a full-time job.
Well,
But my last question,
yeah.
if you don't mind, was if there were had a young scientist who was inspired by your work in the same way that you're taken up by it, and I've been infected by it too now. Um, if they wanted to dedicate their career also to understanding and improving human nature in the way in which you are, what is the one big question which you would challenge them to solve?
Or conceptual answer to your question would be the relationship, the origins of human preferences. Uh, for example, morality. Like, where does our taste for moral behavior come from? And to what extent is our morality intimately connected with our sociality? So I think that there's, of course, a lot of work's been done on this, but I think that is one of the big meta questions is, and that's why my book is called The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, because I think that we have been shaped by natural selection to have a particular kind of goodness. And I think there's still a lot of open questions about that I think would be are worth engaging in.
Nicholas Christakis, thank you very much indeed. Thank you once again for your time. It's very kind of you.
Thank you so much for having me, Philip. It was a nice conversation.
I'm sorry we never got round to the other two bits and pieces of
No, no,
your lab. You'd be pleased to know I didn't get through half of my questions either. I had far too many of them, but we just went with where it went, so that's
that's
fine.
fine. And I threw in an allusion to the global health one at the end. It's fine. Tell me a little bit more about your series and the contrast between the wonderful books behind you. I have some few books like that, and my T-shirt is pretty dramatic.
Well, I'm very fortunate to have a very large collection of antiquarian books because I live in the UK and I started buying them when I was a student many years ago at about £5 each, even though they were 400 years old. So I've got quite a collection of them behind me. You can see a very, very, very small proportion of them, but they're mostly books which I used to collect. Nowadays, they all go off to America and I can't collect them anymore because they're far too expensive for me. But anyway. I'm pleased with what I've got. You've got a nice background there. Is that a real background? That's a nice view
Yes,
you've got wherever you are.
yes, I'm in Vermont, and
Ah,
I have a home library that has about 5,000 volumes, and I have only a couple of hundred books, between 1 and 200 books of the kind you have behind you, mostly from the 19th century, like scientists. Like I have a nice collection of Charles Darwin first editions,
wow.
and um, and then of course poor Alfred Lord Wallace,
Yeah,
you
yeah.
know, who was reduced to writing a book on Darwinism. That's a
Despite
book.
coming in
Whoa.
first. Yeah, yeah,
Yes,
unfortunately.
um, so I really love libraries like that. So tell me a little bit about who watches this, and then I'll decide whether to go change shirts.
Well, I really can't tell you who watches it because I really don't know. What puzzles me is the mystery of the YouTube algorithm, which seems to me to be unfathomable. Some of my videos have had 250,000 hits, and some only get a couple of hundred hits. Um, it was originally put out for my own students. I used to teach master's students at the university. We had a very large number of in the class, 400 at a go, very large auditorium, and I would teach them what I was confessed to them right at the start. I want to teach you how to think. Now, I think a lot of those students follow me now, but since that time, I've been interviewing many, many academics, and from every quarter of life. I had a nice Nobel Prize winning guy on astrophysics in Princeton. I've had a law lord on this side of the Atlantic who. All kinds of people on every subject you can imagine. My biggest hit was a curator from the British Museum who spoke about cuneiform tablets. So that's a surprise to me. Um, I
What kind of scholar or scientist are you? Remind me of your background.
My background is I did quantum mechanics as a postgraduate student with a guy called David Bohm and Basil Hiley. He was a renowned
I know
physician.
Bohm, and my son is a quantum physicist. He got his degree at Princeton, his PhD, and he's now doing a postdoc at Harvard on ultra cold molecules and long range interactions at nanokelvin scale temperatures.
Uh,
So yeah,
uh,
and my father was a physicist as well. So I'm
oh,
saddled with my father trained with actually he got to Princeton right after Einstein had died, and so Archibald Wheeler was his advisor, his
oh,
undergraduate,
yeah.
and
Wheel is very famous in the quantum field. Yeah.
and then um, and then he went to Yale and worked with a man who basically destroyed him. His name was Bright, Breit, a very difficult guy. Anyway, so I'm familiar with physics, and that's great to know who I'm talking to.
Right. Well, that's my background, but and my work in the university in Bournemouth, I have to confess, didn't move in physics circles for a long time. I was teaching research methods, and I basically told them that I was there to teach them how to think, how to
Okay.
question everything, how not to just come up with the group idea and to go along with it, but to rather think for
Okay.
themselves. So that was my aim.
All
And,
right.
you know,
How long will we be speaking?
anything up to an hour, half an hour to an hour is on
Okay.
average about usual, if that's all right with you.
Okay. All right. So
Okay, so I mean, I did first come across you in the book The War on Science, and I did propose we talk about freedom of speech, but you prefer to talk about your human nature lab. So I've prepared a whole pile of questions based around your own work, your own research, and your own lab, if that's all right.
okay, that's great.
I may have one
It's not
question to
it
throw in about freedom of speech.
That's fine. I mean, I care a lot about the defense of liberal society. I'm shocked at how England has been prosecuting so many free speech cases from the right and the left. Just
We
craziness.
are equally as shocked here. I mean, there is a large number of people who do not at all go along with what the political
People
elite want to do.
people are serving prison times in England for Facebook posts. I mean, not even actual incitements to violence, just like, disagreements about immigration or disagreements about gender or disagreements about Palestine. And they're going to jail. I mean, it's just stunning to me that the
If you'd have
country that
told me that 10 years ago that would happen, I would not have believed you. I would have said that was a lie. But things have changed so much in the last 10 years. It is unbelievable even to us, and we despair somewhat. In fact, we'd rather like someone like Trump to come and take over, and
no, no, because
that might be a step too far for some, I appreciate, but I think it's better. It's better than what we have here at the moment. I mean, you don't want people going to prison. I wish we had a First Amendment like you do.
yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of
No,
structure.
no, it's craziness. And they're like, you can't burn a Talmud, you can't burn a Quran in England. It's like Pakistan. It's absurd.
Well, actually, we did have one guy was almost sent to prison for burning the Quran, but on appeal, only a couple last week, I think it was, he got off.
Yeah,
So at least there's
but the
some
fact that he
sign
was
of hope.
yeah, but the fact that he was prosecuted is absurd. And thank you. Do you think people will be interested? I fear it was very academic, our conversation.
Well, my channel's called Amazing Academics. I mean, it's designed for people who are interested in people who actually know what they're talking about. There's so many people on the internet these days who don't actually know what they're talking about,
Yeah.
and they just make things up. But I think the answer is yes. I'd certainly hope so.
All
Um,
right.
but
Well,
but the algorithm is a law unto itself, and I just take what it gives. Blessed be the name of the algorithm.
good luck. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for including me in
Thank
this.
you ever so much indeed, Nicholas. And I wish you well with your lab and your things.
Thank you so much. All right.
Take
Bye-bye.
care.